My name is Ethan, and I've been working in corporate America for over a decade. I've seen it all, the politics, the backstabbing, the long hours. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened with my boss. I loved my job, I really did. I was a marketing manager at a large firm, and I took pride in my work. I was good at it too. My team respected me, and my boss, Rachel, seemed to appreciate my efforts. Or so I thought. I started working at this company 5 years ago, fresh out of college, with big dreams and a strong work ethic. I worked my way up the ladder, taking on more responsibilities and consistently delivering high-quality results. My colleagues would often comment on how organized and efficient I was, and I took that as a badge of honor. But as time went on, I started noticing strange things about Rachel's behavior. She would often undermine my ideas in meetings, and then turn around and present them as her own. She would question my judgment in front of my team, making me feel belittled and unappreciated. At first, I brushed it off as mere office politics, but as the months went by, the incidents piled up, and I realized that something more sinister was at play. I tried to focus on my work, thinking that if I just kept delivering results, Rachel would eventually leave me alone. But it only seemed to get worse. She would micromanage my projects, questioning every little detail, and then turn around and criticize me for not taking enough initiative. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off next. Despite all this, I was determined to succeed. I poured my heart and soul into my work, often putting in 12-hour days and sacrificing my personal life. But no matter how hard I worked, it seemed like Rachel was always one step ahead, waiting to pounce on my mistakes and use them to undermine my credibility. I knew I couldn't keep going on like this. Something had to give, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that I couldn't take much more of this toxic work environment. And then one day everything came to a head. I'd been working under Rachel's supervision for months, and at first, everything seemed fine. She was friendly, even complimentary about my work. But as time went on, I started noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She'd make snide comments about my projects, questioning my judgment in front of my team. One day, I presented a marketing strategy I'd been working on for weeks. Rachel waited until I finished, then proceeded to pick apart every detail. "This is too expensive," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Can't you think of something more cost-effective?" I tried to defend my idea, but she cut me off, telling me to go back to the drawing board. I left the meeting feeling frustrated and demotivated. As the days went by, Rachel's behavior became more erratic. She'd undermine my decisions in front of my team, then pretend like she was just joking when I confronted her about it. I started to doubt my own abilities, wondering if I was indeed not good enough. One morning, Rachel called me into her office, her voice cold and detached. "I've been hearing complaints about your work," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You need to step up your game." I asked her who was complaining, but she just shook her head. "Don't worry about that. Just make sure you're meeting your deadlines." I left her office feeling belittled and anxious. What was going on? Why was Rachel suddenly treating me like this? I started to document every interaction with Rachel, every meeting, every conversation. I wanted to keep track of what was happening, to see if I could find a pattern. As I looked back on our interactions, I realized that Rachel's behavior had been escalating over the past few months. At first, it was just small jabs, but now it was full-blown criticism. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going on like this. Then, one day, Rachel dropped the bombshell. "You're not pulling your weight," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Maybe you're just not cut out for this job." That's when I realized that Rachel wasn't just trying to undermine me. She was trying to destroy my career. I took a deep breath and stood up for myself. "That's not fair," I said, my voice firm. "I've been doing my job to the best of my ability. If you have issues with my performance, let's discuss them like adults." Rachel's face turned red with anger, but I stood my ground. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of uncertainty in her eyes. Maybe she hadn't expected me to push back. In that moment, I knew I had to take control of my career. I couldn't let Rachel dictate my worth. I started looking into company policies, seeking support from HR and my colleagues. I was determined to expose Rachel's true colors and put an end to her toxic behavior. The battle was far from over, but I was ready to fight. I'd had enough of being belittled and undermined. It was time for a change. I'd been noticing that things weren't going as smoothly as they should at work. Meetings would get rescheduled without notice, and important emails would go missing. At first, I thought it was just office chaos, but then I realized that these mishaps were all connected to my projects. One day, I was working on a tight deadline for a major campaign. I'd spent hours preparing the presentation, and everything was going according to plan. But when I arrived at the meeting room, Rachel was already there, chatting with the client. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "I see you're running a bit behind schedule." I was taken aback. "I'm right on time," I said, confused. The client looked puzzled, but Rachel just waved her hand. "Never mind. Let's get started." As we began the presentation, I realized that key slides were missing. I'd prepared them, but they weren't in the deck. I tried to improvise, but it was clear that the client wasn't impressed. After the meeting, I confronted Rachel about the missing slides. "What happened to the presentation?" I asked. Rachel shrugged. "I don't know what you're talking about. I knew I'd prepared the entire deck and I had the files to prove it." "You're sabotaging me," I said, my voice low. Rachel just laughed. "You're being paranoid," she said. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that I had to do something about it. Over the next few days, the sabotage continued. Important documents would disappear, and I'd be blamed for the mistakes. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. One night, I stayed late at the office, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. I reviewed the security footage and discovered that Rachel had been accessing my computer after hours. I realized that I had to gather evidence to prove that Rachel was sabotaging me. I started documenting every incident, every missing document, every rescheduled meeting. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to expose Rachel's behavior and clear my name. The question was, how far would she go to stop me? As I left the office that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel was watching me, waiting for her next move. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to be careful, to cover my tracks. But I was determined to fight back, to take control of my career and my life. The battle was heating up, and I was ready to take on Rachel. No matter what it took, I stood outside the conference room, adjusting my notes for the big presentation. My team was counting on me, and I was confident in our work. As I entered the room, Rachel, my boss, greeted me with a nod. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "Let's get started." I began my presentation, but Rachel interrupted me after just a few minutes. "Can you explain this chart again?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I walked over to the screen and started to explain, but Rachel cut me off. No, let me get this straight," she said, her tone belittling. "You're telling me that this campaign is going to cost us thousands of dollars, and you're not even sure if it's going to work?" I felt a surge of frustration, but I tried to remain calm. "Actually, Rachel, we've run the numbers, and we're confident that this campaign will drive significant returns on investment." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a waste of resources." The room fell silent, and my team looked at me with sympathetic glances. I knew I had to respond, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. "I understand your concerns, Rachel," I said, trying to stay professional. "But I'd appreciate it if you let me finish my presentation before interrupting." Rachel's expression turned cold, and she leaned back in her chair. "Fine. Continue," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I tried to power through the rest of the presentation, but it was clear that Rachel had already made up her mind. As we finished up and the team started to file out of the room, Rachel turned to me and said, "You know, Ethan, maybe you should stick to the numbers. Leave the creative work to someone else." I felt a sting from her comment, but I bit back a response. Instead, I nodded and said, "I'll take that into consideration." As I left the conference room, I couldn't help but wonder what had triggered Rachel's behavior. Was it something I'd done, or was there something more going on? I decided to talk to my colleagues and see if they'd noticed anything similar. Maybe together, we could figure out what was going on and find a way to address it. But as I walked back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's behavior was just the beginning of a much larger problem. I was working on a tight deadline for a major project, and everything seemed to be on track. I'd submitted my proposal, and the client was eager to move forward. But when I arrived at the meeting with the client and Rachel, I realized that something was off. "Let's get started," Rachel said, her voice friendly, but her eyes seemed to bore into me. The client asked about the proposal, and I began to explain, but Rachel interrupted me. "I think we need to revisit some of the numbers," she said, her voice dripping with doubt. I pulled out my notes and started to explain the figures, but Rachel kept cutting me off, questioning my judgment and expertise. The client started to look confused, and I could feel my frustration growing. After the meeting, I confronted Rachel about her behavior. "What's going on?" I asked. "You're undermining me in front of the client." Rachel just shrugged. "I'm trying to help," she said. "You're not thinking clearly about this project." But I knew what I was doing. I'd spent weeks researching and planning, and I was confident in my approach. I realized that Rachel was sabotaging me, trying to make me look incompetent in front of the client. I decided to investigate further. I started documenting every interaction with Rachel, every meeting, every conversation. And what I found shocked me. Rachel had been secretly meeting with the client, discussing changes to the project without my knowledge or input. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. How could Rachel do this to me? I was her team member, and she was supposed to support me, not undermine me. I knew I had to take action. I couldn't let Rachel's sabotage continue. I started to gather evidence, documenting every instance of her interference, and I was determined to confront her about it, to put an end to her behavior once and for all. The question was, how would Rachel react when she found out I was onto her? Would she try to deny it, or would she escalate the situation? I was about to find out. I'd been documenting every instance of Rachel's sabotage, every meeting, every conversation. I had a thick file of evidence, and I was ready to take it to HR. But before I could, something happened that made me realize I'd had enough. Rachel called me into her office, her voice cold and detached. "I need to see your project plan," she said. I handed it over, wondering what she was looking for, but as she scanned the pages, her expression turned ugly. "This is unacceptable," she said. "You're not meeting the deadlines, and your work is subpar." I tried to defend myself, but Rachel wouldn't listen. "You're not a team player, Ethan," she said. "You're holding everyone back." I'd had enough. "That's not fair," I said, my voice rising. "I've done everything you've asked me to do, but you've been sabotaging me every step of the way." Rachel's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but I wasn't going to back down. "I have proof," I said. "I know you've been meeting with the client behind my back, and I've documented every instance of sabotage." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "You think you can take me down?" she said. "I'll destroy you before you can even think about going to HR." I realized then that Rachel was more powerful than I'd thought. She had connections in the company, and she would stop at nothing to protect herself. But I was determined to stand up for myself, no matter what. "I'll take my chances," I said, my voice firm. Rachel's face turned red with anger, and for a moment I thought she might lash out at me, but then she seemed to regain control. "Fine," she said. "You want to play it that way? Let's see how far you get." I knew then that my career was on the line, but I was ready to fight. I'd had enough of Rachel's sabotage, and I was going to take her down. I'd been working non-stop for weeks, trying to meet the impossible deadlines Rachel had set. But no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. She was always finding fault, always criticizing me in front of my colleagues. I started to doubt myself, wondering if I was good enough for the job. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe I was incompetent. I began to feel like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing when Rachel would lash out at me next. My colleagues noticed the change in me, and they started to ask if everything was okay. But I just shook my head, not wanting to burden them with my problems. At home, my family was getting concerned. "You're working too much," my wife said. "You need to take care of yourself." But I knew I couldn't take a break. Rachel would just use it against me, saying I wasn't dedicated to my job. One night I broke down in tears, feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. I didn't know how much more I could take. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. I couldn't quit my job, I had bills to pay. And I couldn't take it to HR, I wasn't sure if they'd believe me. I felt trapped, like I was stuck in a never-ending nightmare. And Rachel was the one controlling the script. I started to wonder if I'd ever be able to escape, if I'd ever be able to find a job where I felt valued and respected. The uncertainty was suffocating me. I knew I had to take action, but I didn't know where to start. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going on like this. Something had to change. I sat in my dimly lit living room, the only sound the soft hum of the clock on the wall. My mind was racing, replaying every conversation, every meeting, every instance of Rachel's sabotage. I knew I had to take action to plan my revenge. I started by gathering evidence, documenting every instance of Rachel's behavior. I made a list of dates, times, and details of each incident. I also started tracking her patterns, noticing when she was most likely to interfere with my work. As I gathered more evidence, I realized that Rachel's behavior wasn't just about undermining me. It was about control. She wanted to dictate every aspect of my work, to make me feel powerless. I knew I had to use that against her. I started brainstorming ways to expose her behavior, to show her true colors to our boss and the rest of the team. I thought about talking to HR, but I knew they might not take me seriously. I decided to take a different approach. I would gather enough evidence to prove Rachel's sabotage, and then I would confront her directly. I would make sure she knew that I was onto her, that I wouldn't be bullied or intimidated. I started to formulate a plan, thinking about how I could gather more evidence without putting myself at risk. I knew I had to be careful, that Rachel would stop at nothing to protect herself. I spent hours researching, gathering information, and making a plan. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to take Rachel down. I was tired of being her puppet, tired of being controlled. As I sat in the darkness, a sense of determination washed over me. I was going to take back control, to show Rachel that I wouldn't be pushed around. I was going to make her pay for what she had done to me. The question was, how far would Rachel go to stop me? Would she try to sabotage my efforts, or would she take it to the next level? I was about to find out. I started by documenting every instance of Rachel's sabotage, every meeting, every conversation. I made a note of the dates, times, and details of each incident. I also saved emails and messages that showed her interference. As I gathered more evidence, I realized that Rachel's behavior was consistent. She would often wait until the last minute to criticize my work, making it impossible for me to fix the issues. She would also undermine my authority in front of my colleagues, making it seem like I was incompetent. I started to build a timeline of her behavior, showing how it had escalated over time. I also made a list of witnesses who could corroborate my story. I knew I needed concrete evidence, something that would prove Rachel's sabotage beyond a doubt. I started to record our conversations, using my phone to capture her criticisms and undermining comments. I also talked to my colleagues, asking if they had experienced similar behavior from Rachel. Some of them were hesitant to speak up, but others were more than willing to share their own stories of sabotage. As I gathered more evidence, my case against Rachel grew stronger. I knew I had to be careful, that she would stop at nothing to discredit me. But I was determined to expose her behavior, to show her true colors to our boss and the rest of the team. I spent hours organizing my evidence, making sure I had a solid case. I knew I would need to present it to HR or our boss, and I wanted to make sure I had everything I needed to prove my point. As I sat at my desk reviewing my evidence, I felt a sense of confidence. I knew I had a strong case, and I was ready to take it to the next level. I was ready to confront Rachel, to show her that I wouldn't be bullied or intimidated. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next step would be crucial. I would need to be calm and composed, to present my evidence clearly and confidently. I was ready to take on Rachel, to expose her behavior and bring it to an end. I stood outside Rachel's office, my heart racing as I prepared for the confrontation. I had been gathering evidence for weeks, documenting every instance of her sabotage and undermining behavior. I was ready to present my case, to show her that I wouldn't be bullied or intimidated. I took a deep breath, then walked into her office. Rachel looked up from her computer, a hint of surprise on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral. "I need to talk to you about your behavior," I said, my voice firm. "I've been documenting every instance of sabotage and undermining comments. I have evidence." Rachel's expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice dismissive. "I'm talking about the way you've been treating me," I said. "The constant criticism, the undermining comments, the sabotage, it's unacceptable, and I'm not going to stand for it." Rachel leaned back in her chair, a look of amusement on her face. "You're being paranoid," she said. "You're just not used to constructive criticism." "Constructive criticism?" I repeated. "You call sabotaging my work and undermining me in front of my colleagues constructive criticism?" Rachel shrugged. "You're just too sensitive. You need to toughen up." I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my cool. "I'm not being sensitive," I said. "I'm being treated unfairly, and I'm not going to stand for it. I have evidence, and I'm going to take it to HR if I have to." Rachel's expression changed, a look of concern crossing her face. "You wouldn't do that," she said. "I would," I said. "And I will, if you don't stop your behavior. I'm not going to be bullied or intimidated. I'm going to stand up for myself, and I'm going to make sure that you're held accountable for your actions." Rachel's face turned red with anger, but I stood my ground. I was determined to confront her, to show her that I wouldn't be pushed around. I was ready to take on her behavior, to expose her sabotage and bring it to an end. I stood in front of the entire team, my evidence in hand. "I want to talk about something that's been going on in this team," I said, my voice clear and confident. "Something that's affected me, and probably others as well." Rachel looked up from her notes, a hint of concern on her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "I'm talking about the sabotage," I said. "The constant undermining comments, the last-minute changes, the lack of support. I've documented every instance, and I have proof." The team looked at each other, some of them nodding in agreement. "We've seen it," one of them said. "We've witnessed it." Rachel's face turned red with anger. "This is just a personal vendetta," she said. "You're just trying to get back at me." But I wasn't having it. "I have evidence," I said, "emails, messages, witness statements. I've documented everything, and I'm going to share it with HR, with our boss, with anyone who will listen." The team started to murmur, some of them sharing their own stories of sabotage. Rachel's face turned white, and she looked like she was about to lose control. "I think it's time for a change," one of the team members said. "We can't keep working like this." The team started to nod in agreement, and I knew I had won. Rachel's behavior had been exposed, and she would have to face the consequences. But as I looked at Rachel, I saw something in her eyes that made me pause, a glimmer of desperation, a hint of panic, and I realized that this was far from over. I sat in the conference room, surrounded by my colleagues and HR representatives. Rachel sat across from me, her face pale and drawn. "I'd like to start by saying that I'm glad this has come to light," one of the HR representatives said. "Rachel's behavior has been unacceptable, and we're taking immediate action." Rachel's eyes dropped, and she didn't argue. She knew she had been caught. "The question is, what do we do now?" another HR representative asked. I spoke up. "I think Rachel should be removed from her position," I said. "She's shown that she's not capable of leading a team, and her behavior has been toxic." The team nodded in agreement. "We can't work with her anymore," one of them said. The HR representatives nodded, taking notes. "We'll investigate further and take necessary actions," one of them said. As the meeting concluded, Rachel stood up, her eyes welling up with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." But it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done, and it was time for consequences. I left the conference room feeling a sense of relief, knowing that the sabotage had finally been exposed. But I also knew that the aftermath would be long and difficult. The team would need to rebuild, and I would need to find a way to heal from the wounds Rachel had inflicted. As I walked back to my desk, I saw my colleagues gathering around, congratulating me on my bravery. "You did the right thing," one of them said. But I knew that this was just the beginning. The real challenge would be rebuilding the team and moving forward, and I was ready to face it head on. Have you ever faced a similar situation at work or in your personal life? Share your story in the comments below and let's support each other in standing up against toxic behavior. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories and discussions on workplace dynamics and personal growth.